Welcome. I'm Kelly Kivlin. I'm the assistant curator at DIA, and thank you all for being here for the last of the spring series of the Artist and Artist Lectures. It's my pleasure to welcome Erica Baum, who's going to be speaking on Lawrence Weiner. And it's quite interesting, actually, because we've had the series since 2001, and this is the first lecture on Lawrence we've had. So not too much pressure, but I think Erica is the perfect choice, and it really is a pleasure to introduce her. I met her a couple years ago during a studio visit. I've had a couple since, and what I left with in each of my visits was more questions than answers, and I always think that's quite a good sign. So a little bit more, too, for those that don't know about Erica's practice. Her work is very much rooted in photography, and it often manipulates the medium to explore more interrelations between language and image making. And I think both of these, she really does call much of her resource and much of the content from found printed matter, sometimes of which it's paperbacks, other times in older series it was library card files. And with this, she's really committed to the format of the series, which for those of you that know her work, it's an investigation in these series that really brings forth much of what she's exploring. And that interest in text very much comes forth. And she utilizes collage and print methods to index and both challenge conceptions of image making, but she also has a linguist eye that really is producing these fragmented but fine-tuned poetic remnants. And I think that's what makes her work so special, is that it's both an object and an image, but it also is very much text-laden. And the message is almost a duality at times. She received her MFA in photography from the Yale School of Art, and since then she's had a very nice and many solo exhibitions and group exhibitions. I'm just going to list a few of the recent ones. She's had her work recently shown at Bureau in New York and the Kunstverein Langenhagen in Germany. And group exhibitions in the last few years have included After Dark at MOMCO in Geneva, as well as the Athens Biennale. And she was in Postscript, a really wonderful show that was investigating language, both in sort of the conceptual, poetic format, but also in image making. And that began at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Denver. And in 2015, she will have an exhibition at the Galerie Crève-Cœur in Paris. And her work will also be included in the exhibition Photopoetics at the Guggenheim. I think that's opening in the fall, is that correct? Great. Thank you again for all being here. It's really a pleasure to welcome Erica, and we will be taking a few questions after, so I welcome you to sort of bring forth your thoughts then. Thanks again.
I'd like to begin by saying thank you to everyone at DIA for all the help I've received, and a special thank you to Kelly for her encouragement all along and for inviting me to do this. So thank you so much. Many exhibitions have borrowed titles from Lawrence Weiner's work, like the recent printed matter show at NYU titled Learn to Read Art. So for this talk, I'm taking two titles. First, an accumulation of information taken from here to there. And secondly, bits and pieces put together to present a semblance of a whole. This first one is an installation view from a 2012 exhibition at Speroni Westwater in New York, and the work is shown here along with Carl Andre's aluminum cardinals. And bits and pieces, this is in the Walker Art Center, at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. And I also have this t-shirt. It says, Incessant Grace. And Lawrence Weiner once mentioned a matador's gesture in the bullfighting ring when talking about another piece, the grace of a gesture. Anyway, so I'm taking that Lawrence word grace. Weiner's work takes place in gallery spaces, public spaces, in book form, on posters, and even on clothing, to name some but not all. All of this work across time and through a variety of platforms engages in an ongoing dialogue with itself. Words that reappear in a different time and place engage with both the current moment as well as earlier moments. As Liz Kotz writes in her book, Words to be Looked At, Language in 1960s Art, Weiner's statements programmatically accept that inherent abstraction of language, the relative instability of reference, and the capacities of utterances to signify differently in each act of enunciation. It's this abstraction that allows infinite situations and applications of meaning. In this talk, I will be looking at a few biographical details about Lawrence Weiner, as well as the evolution of his work as it's been presented in a variety of settings. And I will show a few examples of my work and the work of others along the way. Lawrence Weiner was born in the Bronx in 1942. He graduated from Stuyvesant High School and studied philosophy at Hunter College before dropping out and heading west for a time. According to Donna DeSalvo in her 2007 essay, As Far as the Eye Can See, from the Catalogue for the exhibition of the same name at the Whitney Museum of American Art, Lawrence Weiner occasionally cites an early childhood habit of making chalk drawings on the sidewalk in front of his parents' candy store as an indication of his long-standing recognition that art can be inscribed within an everyday environment. I also grew up in New York. My mother came from Brooklyn, where her grandparents had a dry goods store, and my father came from the Bronx. I grew up in Mitchell-Lama affordable housing on the Upper West Side in the 1960s and 70s. While you can never trace a straight path from early influences to later work, I shared the early visual experiences of a dense urban upbringing. This is by the photographer Helen Levitt, photographing in New York in 1938. Bill Jones' Mother is a Whore. A great example of a chalk inscription. And here's another one by Helen Levitt, also in New York, also 1938. Button to Secret Passage Press, or Press Button to Secret Passage. And this is by Bresai, photographing in Paris in the 40s, another artist looking closely at these chance inscriptions. These artists draw attention to the dynamic energy of the city, with all the potential for found imagery in the constantly changing mise-en-scène of the streets. As Alan Capro once stated, the everyday world is the most astonishing inspiration conceivable. A walk down 14th Street is more amazing than any masterpiece of art. This is by Walker Evans, workers loading neon damage sign into truck, West 11th Street, New York City. And it's dated 1928/30, so I guess the date isn't precise. Photographs can show us that you never walk down the same street twice. Lawrence Weiner's work exemplifies this. Each execution of his work becomes a new piece. The works reference location, movement of materials, and place directly and indirectly. There's repetition, but as Gertrude Stein would say, there is no repetition, only the continuous present, where writing recreates itself anew in each successive moment. This is from a 1991 exhibition at DIA called Displacement. And bits and pieces put together to present a semblance of a whole, also from that same show, and also part of the title of this talk. Growing up in New York in the 1970s, graffiti was everywhere. I went to City School, an alternative public high school located at the time in downtown Brooklyn on Skirmahorn Street, near Borough Hall, and within walking distance from the Board of Education, so that they could keep an eye on us. There were about 50 kids there, most of them dropouts from music and art and Stuyvesant. We took a combination of internships and college classes all over the city. Because our schedules were unusual, we were given bags of subway tokens to supplement our school subway passes. Zoe Leonard and Jean-Michel Basquiat were also there. While we were all still in high school, Jean-Michel developed his SAMO project with fellow student Al Diaz. SAMO for the so-called avant-garde. SAMO is a result of overexposure. These are photographs taken by the Fluxus artist Henry Flint. All the graffiti artists wanted to add their own layer to the city's palimpsest, but what made SAMO so distinct was the sense of humor in conversation with the art world. They used the form of graffiti to take that conversation beyond the usual boundaries of name tagging. And I say they because it wasn't just Jean, it was Jean and Al. In the 1990s, towards the end of graduate school, I started photographing blackboards. I was interested in capturing the partially erased ephemeral traces left by the teachers in between classes. Here we have moved from the child's hand on the street to the trace of the professor's hand on the blackboard. Many of the themes explored by Lawrence Weiner were present from the very beginning. In some of his earliest works, you can see his sculptural interest in accessible materials, their placement, location, and removal. In 1960, without permission and sharing the graffiti artist's readiness for transgression, Lawrence Weiner set off a series of TNT explosions in a state park in Mill Valley, California. This was a cratering piece, and it carved out some of the earth. This picture is not from that because that wasn't, I don't believe that was documented. This is the residue of a flare ignited by a boundary in 1969, but it kind of gives you a bit of a feeling of the TNT, so it illustrates that. And it was a removal. Then returning to New York, he continued working with accessible materials. This is what is set upon the table, sits upon the table. In the early 1960s, dissatisfied with carving a limestone block in his studio, he took it out to his Bleecker Street backyard. Continuing to move it around, he began to see that what was most interesting to him was this action or performance of moving the stone. The way the stone looked was not the key thing. Sculpture was the movement or transfer of mass from one plane to another. This can be linked back to the cratering piece, the displacement of mass from the earth, and linked forward to his removal paintings, and then thematically related later on in his work, for example, in Displacement, shown in 1991, and later in Venice. From 1966 to 1968, Lawrence Weiner made removal paintings. Oh, and also he considers painting to be sculpture. I just want to make sure that's clear. In each removal, painting a small rectangular notch would be removed from the bottom frame of the canvas. Lawrence Weiner would invite the recipient of the piece to choose the color a canvas should be painted and also have them determine the size of the piece to be removed. In this way, the recipient of the piece was invited to complete the piece. In addition, Lawrence Weiner gave instruction to anyone receiving the work. The person who was receiving the painting would say what size they wanted, what color they wanted, how big a removal they wanted. From there, he moved on to objects, and with this work, he would specify that the person had to choose the object in use, in this case, choose a rug in use. And you would have, this piece is titled, A Square Removal from a Rug in Use. In 1969, Lawrence Weiner presented his now famous statement of intent, describing the three conditions in which his works could exist. They could be constructed by him, fabricated by someone else, or not built at all. He arrived at a statement of intent in reacting to the damage done to a piece he had constructed for a group exhibition at Windham College in Vermont. The piece was titled, A Series of Stakes Set in the Ground at Regular Intervals to Form a Rectangle, Twine strung from stake to demark a grid, a rectangle removed from this rectangle. Students used the field where the sculpture was installed for sports and ended up damaging the work. It was then that he realized that it didn't matter if the work existed in that form. The work was already done. The work resided in the language used and the materials referred to. This is his statement of intent. The artist may construct the work. The work may be fabricated. The work need not be built. Each being equal and consistent with the intent of the artist, the decision as to condition rests with the receiver upon the occasion of receivership. So I took these pictures recently at DIA. The work consists of the language and the materials referred to. We see the language he is presenting, with the potential intact for a myriad of possible forms, and we understand that the language refers to materials and what can happen to those materials. The key thing to remember is that this is sculpture. According to Lawrence Weiner, it is not poetry. For him, language is red paint, another material for the sculptor to employ. And as I said before, paintings come under the larger heading of sculpture. This is a photograph from my 1998 series titled Frick, based on an index to a photo archive at the Frick Art Reference Library. Art historians would conduct research by looking up 8x10 photos of paintings. These are the librarian's notes on the back of the index cards. They correspond to a specific painting as well as cross-referencing the subjects of art in general. My selection of the text invites the viewer to imagine both the absent painting and the subject matter of art, as well as conjuring up an independent poetic scenario. This question of what we do and don't see runs throughout the work of Lawrence Weiner. Lawrence Weiner says he was interested in working with words because, unlike paintings, for example, language has no edge. My work isn't sculpture, but I share Lawrence Weiner's interest not only in words, but also in going past that edge. You have what you are looking at, and also that suggestion of what lies beyond the frame. In these works from the Frick archive, the part that you don't see is implied by the part that you do see. However, in my work, the part that you do see is meant to be experienced as a kind of poetry. I don't have a problem with poetry. And the part that you don't see, rather than being sculpture, is more about reflecting systems and institutions, and in the case of the Frick project, the subjects of art, the conceptual categories that organize art, as well as reflecting the particularities of an individual librarian's use of those broader systems to organize art. So a lot takes place off stage. When I was growing up, I wanted to be a writer. Drawing and painting were always a part of my life, but reading was my obsession and writing my aspiration. The presentation of found language in many of my projects constitutes my writing. I'm allowing my appropriations to be my voice. It's a voice that comes out of a chance interaction within a given system. I set up the parameters. In other words, I'm determining that system, or what I'll give that system, but I don't know what I will find. In the card catalog series, I'm looking for the chance juxtapositions determined by the Dewey Decimal System, as well as the idiosyncrasies of any given librarian's interpretation of that system. There's a presence and an absence. Liz Kotz, in her book Words to be Looked at, Language in 1960s Art, makes a compelling case for the precedence to Lawrence Weiner's work, tracing a route from Cage's 4-minute and 33-second score to George Brecht's event scores, as well as Alan Capro's happenings. George Brecht and Alan Capro were both students of Cage in his experimental composition class at the New School in the late 1950s. So I'm going to show 3 works by George Brecht, and they're all dated from 1961. On the top, 3 aqueous events: ice, water, steam. And then below, 6 exhibits: ceiling, first wall, second wall, third wall, fourth wall, floor. And here, word event, exit. I love this work. I love the complex simplicity. It's activated by the viewer and activated by the perception of the viewer, similar to the experience of so-called silence in Cage's work. And as Liz Kotz emphasizes, the score itself becomes a place where the artwork resides as well. We notice the score. So the experience of perception is activated on many levels at once. Kotz says, by focusing on things that are happening all the time, whether noticed or not, signs posted, faucets dripping, phones ringing, and substances existing in state whose change is too slow to perceive, Brecht aligns the temporality of language with that of the event. Continual, recurring, agentless. In these scores, the event is internal to the score and the reading of the score, so that the actual performance, although possible, is no longer necessary to enact or complete the piece. As Brecht remarks, there isn't any way in which exit should be performed. There's only an exit sign hanging over the door. Liz Kotz goes on to say, inevitably calling to mind Lawrence Weiner's highly condensed and yet generalizable statements, Brecht scores reduced language to a kind of object, but also establishes a kind of repeatable, replaceable structure, open to unlimited, unforeseeable realizations. She continues, if I am, in effect, reading Brecht through Weiner, it is because I believe that Weiner's explicit activation of the receiver is modeled on the implicitly performative positioning of the viewer, reader, listener in these post-Cagean projects, just as his repeated statements that there's no way to build a piece incorrectly inevitably echo a wider ethic of indeterminacy. And so here's another example of work from the 60s, that same time, that provides a context for Lawrence Weiner's work with language as sculpture. This is William Anastasi's piece, 12 Ounces of Tap Water on a Floor, from 1966, Variable Dimensions. I love that part, variable dimensions. It's another kind of performance with indeterminate results. And here, Lawrence Weiner's 1 quart exterior green industrial enamel thrown on a brick wall from 1968. Lawrence Weiner actually fabricated this work, hurling paint against the facade of his home. And also in 1968, Douglas Hubler sent this New Yorker cartoon to Lawrence Weiner. It says, "The design was on the wall. We only had to frame it." According to Donna DeSalvo in her essay for the Whitney Retrospective Catalogue, Lawrence Weiner shared a concern for the quotidian, the concrete, and the tangible with contemporaneous artists like Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, and Frank Stella. And it is important to continue to keep in mind his primary concern is sculpture. This is Richard Serra's verb list, Actions to Perform on Materials, dated 1967-68. I'm going to read just not all of them, actually, because I can't read his script that easily. So I'm not reading all of them. To roll, to crease, to fold, to store, to bend, to shorten, to twist, to dapple, to crumple, to shave, to tear, to chip, to split, to cut. And then I couldn't really read that next one if anyone wants to shout it out. Thanks. And this is Lawrence Weiner's Traces, dated from 1970. I can read all of this. Ignited, fermented. It's interesting, really, because you realize how much he's employed these words throughout the course of all his work. Not all of them, but quite a lot of them, and this is from 1970. Ignited, fermented, displaced, transferred, breached, painted, smudged, flushed, marred, reduced, obstructed, strung, shored, split, folded, dragged, bored, translated, stained, sprayed, dug, spanned, placed, pitted, shattered, cratered, abridged, affronted, diverted, glued, poured, sanded, tossed, removed, turned, secured, thrown, demarked, bleached, mixed, mucked, locked, cabled, bracketed, mined, smelted, notched, mashed, greased, ruptured. And 2 minutes of spray paint directly on the floor in 1968. This is at the 2007 exhibition at the Whitney. Okay. In interviews over the years, Lawrence Weiner has often stated that art is not a metaphor upon the relationship of human beings to objects and objects to objects in relation to human beings, but a representation of an empirical existing fact. He argues it does not tell the potential and capabilities of an object, but presents a reality concerning that relationship. Whenever I came across this statement, and I came across this statement over and over again, in preparing for this talk, I kept thinking of a passage from Molloy by Samuel Beckett. I only read it once years ago, but it has always stayed with me, and so I looked it up so that I could read it aloud to you now while we're looking at these works and thinking about Lawrence Weiner's sculptural concerns. I took advantage of being at the seaside to lay in a store of sucking stones. They were pebbles, but I call them stones. Yes, on this occasion, I laid in a considerable store. I distributed them equally between my 4 pockets and sucked them turn and turn about. This raised a problem which I first solved in the following way. I had, say, 16 stones 4 in each of my 4 pockets, these being the 2 pockets of my trousers and the 2 pockets of my greatcoat. Taking a stone from the right pocket of my greatcoat and putting it in my mouth, I replaced it in the right pocket of my greatcoat by a stone from the right pocket of my trousers, which I replaced by a stone from the left pocket of my trousers, which I replaced by a stone from the left pocket of my greatcoat, which I replaced by the stone which was in my mouth as soon as I had finished sucking it. Thus, there were still 4 stones in each of my 4 pockets, but not quite the same stones. And when the desire to suck took hold of me again, I drew again on the right pocket of my greatcoat, certain of not taking the same stone as the last time. And while I sucked it, I rearranged the other stones in the way I have just described, and so on. But this solution did not satisfy me fully, for it did not escape me that by an extraordinary hazard, the 4 stones circulating thus might always be the same stone, same 4. In which case, far from sucking the 16 stones turn and turn about, I was really only sucking 4, always the same, turn and turn about. But I shuffled them well in my pockets before I began to suck, and again while I sucked, before transferring them, in the hope of obtaining a more general circulation of the stones from pocket to pocket. But this was only a makeshift that could not long content a man like me. So I began to look for something else. I might do better to transfer the stones 4 by 4 instead of 1 by 1, that is to say, during the sucking. To take the 3 stones remaining in the right pocket of my greatcoat and replace them by the 4 in the right pocket of my trousers, and these by the 4 in the left pocket of my trousers, and these by the 4 in the left pocket of my greatcoat. And finally, these by the 3 from the right pocket of my greatcoat, plus the 1, as soon as I had finished sucking it, which was in my mouth. Yes, it seemed to me at first that by so doing I would arrive at a better result. But on further reflection, I had to change my mind and confess that the circulation of the stones, 4 by 4, came to exactly the same thing as their circulation 1 by 1. For if I was certain of finding each time in the right pocket of my greatcoat 4 stones totally different from their immediate predecessors, the possibility nevertheless remained of my always chancing on the same stone within each group of 4, and consequently of my sucking not the 16 turn and turn about as I wished, but in fact 4 only, always the same, turn and turn about. So I had to seek elsewhere than in the mode of circulation, for no matter how I caused the stones to circulate, I always ran the same risk. It was obvious that by increasing the number of my pockets, I was bound to increase my chances of enjoying my stones in the way I planned, that is to say, one after the other until the number was exhausted. Had I had 8 pockets, for example, instead of the 4 I did have, then even the most diabolical hazard could not have prevented me from sucking at least 8 of my 16 stones, turn and turn about. The truth is, I should have needed 16 pockets in order to be quite easy in my mind. And for a long time, I could see no other conclusion than this, that short of having 16 pockets, each with its stone, I could never reach the goal I had set myself, short of an extraordinary hazard. And if at a pinch I could double the number of my pockets, were it only by dividing each pocket in 2, with the help of a few safety pins, let us say, to quadruple them seemed to be more than I could manage, and I did not feel inclined to take all that trouble for a half measure. For I was beginning to lose all sense of measure, after all this wrestling and wrangling, and to say all or nothing. And if I was tempted for an instant to establish a more equitable proportion between my stones and my pockets by reducing the former to the number of the latter, it was only for an instant, for it would have been an admission of defeat. And sitting on the shore, before the sea, the 16 stones spread out before my eyes, I gazed at them in anger and perplexity. One day suddenly it dawned on me, dimly, that I might perhaps achieve my purpose without increasing the number of my pockets, or reducing the number of my stones, but simply by sacrificing the principle of trim. The meaning of this illumination, which suddenly began to sing within me, like a verse of Isaiah or of Jeremiah, I did not penetrate at once. And notably, the word trim, which I had never met with in this sense, long remained obscure. Finally, I seemed to grasp that this word trim could not here mean anything else, anything better, than the distribution of the 16 stones in 4 groups of 4, 1 group in each pocket, and that it was my refusal to consider any distribution other than this that had vitiated my calculations until then and rendered the problem literally insoluble. And it was on the basis of this interpretation, whether right or wrong, that I finally reached a solution, inelegant, assuredly, but sound. Now I'm willing to believe, indeed, I firmly believe, that other solutions to this problem might have been found, and indeed may still be found, no less sound, but much more elegant than the one I shall now describe, if I can. Good. Now I can begin to suck. Watch me closely. I take a stone from the right pocket of my greatcoat, the one empty of stones. I take a second stone from the right pocket of my greatcoat, suck it, put it in the left pocket of my greatcoat, and so on until the right pocket of my greatcoat is empty, apart from its usual and casual contents. And the 6 stones I have just sucked, one after the other, are all in the left pocket of my greatcoat. Pausing then and concentrating so as not to make a balls of it, I transfer to the right pocket of my greatcoat, in which there are no stones left, the 5 stones in the right pocket of my trousers, which are replaced by the 5 stones in the left pocket of my trousers, which are replaced by the 6 stones in the left pocket of my greatcoat. At this stage, then, the left pocket of my greatcoat is again empty of stones, while the right pocket of my greatcoat is again supplied, and in the right way, that is to say, with other stones than those I have just sucked. These other stones I then begin to suck, one after the other, and to transfer as I go along to the left pocket of my greatcoat, being absolutely certain, as far as one can be in an affair of this kind, that I am not sucking the same stones as a moment before, but others. And when the right pocket of my greatcoat is again empty of stones, and the 5 I have just sucked are all without exception in the left pocket of my greatcoat, then I proceed to the same redistribution as a moment before, or a similar redistribution. That is to say, I transfer to the right pocket of my greatcoat, now again available, the 5 stones in the right pocket of my trousers, which are replaced by the 6 stones in the left pocket of my trousers, which are replaced by the 5 stones in the left pocket of my greatcoat. And there I am ready to begin again. Do I have to go on? There was something more than a principle I abandoned when I abandoned the equal distribution. It was a bodily need. But to suck the stones in the way I have described, not haphazard, but with method, was also, I think, a bodily need. Here, then, are 2 incompatible bodily needs at loggerheads. Such things happen. But deep down, I didn't give a tinker's curse about being off my balance. Dragged to the right hand and the left, backwards and forwards. And deep down, it was all the same to me whether I sucked a different stone each time or always the same stone until the end of time. For they all tasted exactly the same. And if I had collected 16, it was not in order to ballast myself in such and such a way, or to suck them turnabout, but simply to have a little store so as never to be without. But deep down, I didn't give a fiddler's curse about being without. When they were all gone, they would be all gone. I wouldn't be any the worse off, or hardly any. And the solution to which I rallied in the end was to throw away all the stones but one, which I kept now in one pocket, now in another, and which, of course, I soon lost, or threw away, or gave away, or swallowed. Having bridged the gap, having avoided the pitfall, having made the point, all with an end in view. All of these things end up seeming to me like metaphors about making art. Lawrence Weiner says his work isn't poetry and it isn't a specific metaphor, but the viewer will take away their own interpretation. I recently read a new translation of Madame Bovary, and in the introduction, the translator describes how Flaubert had to go against his impulse to embellish. Flaubert writes slowly, discarding a good deal of material, pruning back severely the material he keeps. He reads his drafts aloud to his closest friend, the poet Louis Bouillet, who responds that he likes it very much, or Flaubert should cut further, or there are too many metaphors. To counter Flaubert's tendency to wax lyrical and effusive in response to exotic materials, as he did in The Temptation of St. Anthony, the poet suggested that Flaubert take as his subject for his novel something mundane. And for me, the simple and pared down, arrived through restraint, is what ultimately can achieve complexity. And I approach my work with these principles, and I'm most drawn to the more austere examples of Lawrence Weiner's work. This is from a website called Radical Art, and I love the way they combined all these pieces that you can see many of them at once. Drops of blue water forced over the rim of a pot made of clay. Many colored objects placed side by side to form a row of many colored objects. A bit of matter and a little bit more put in place. over the water and into the trees. He's done so much work that it's just nice actually sometimes to just see a whole bunch of them. I found this book at the Strand, Specific and General Works. It contains all the works up to 1993 in every language in which they occur, as well as a translation in French, as it's a French publication. It explains how the works are dated. The works have never been dated, but they're cataloged, and they've been cataloged not from initial conception, but from their first public presentation. Persons wishing to ascertain the date of a work may use the following rough method. So I'm going to show some examples of that so you can see. Here's a wall stained by water and floatable objects thrown into inland waterways, one each month for 7 years. And the 067 and 068 are close to the gutter, and those are the catalog numbers, and they indicate that the works are dated from 1969. And here's a square removal from a rug in use. And a cup of seawater poured upon the floor, also both from 1969. It's great to see the works presented here in a book, and then also remember that many of them have taken form in other types of situations. For example, a rubber ball thrown at the sea. This piece was produced for a show in 1969 at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, organized by Seth Ziegelup. The exhibition catalog serves as the only lasting presentation of the works from the show, which were predominantly ephemeral actions performed by the artists Terry Atkinson and Michael Baldwin, Robert Barry, Jan Dibbets, Douglas Hubler, Stephen Kaltenbach, Joseph Kossuth, Saul Lowett, Anything Company Limited, and Lawrence Weiner. This is Ziegelup's outline of the show. The exhibition will have no title. The overall plan: 1, print 1,000 copies of the enclosed poster before the exhibition opens and distribute. 2, during the 19th of May and 19th of June, the work of each artist will be introduced to the community at Simon Fraser. 3, towards the end of the exhibition, a catalog of the exhibition, what has happened, will be printed and distributed. In the section of the catalog titled Presentation, a description of Lawrence Weiner's execution of the piece is given. On the 23rd of May, 1969, the words, "Rubber ball thrown at sea," were typed in block letters immediately above the artist's name on an 8.5 by 11-inch sheet of white paper, photocopied and distributed in the mailboxes of all students and faculty members and mailed out to interested parties. In the book here, it's shown alongside another piece about water, a natural watercourse diverted, reduced, or displaced. Water, location, removal, and displacement are all recurring themes. Here's out on the ice, thick and thin, and out to sea over the horizon, underwater, out to sea under the clouds, underwater. 2 works from 1990. This is from an exhibition in 2004 at the Museo Tamayo in Mexico. And this is from rooms in Gertrude Stein's Tender Buttons. This cloud does change with the movements of the moon and the quite narrow suggestion of the building. It does, and then when it is settled and no sounds differ, then comes the moment when cheerfulness is so assured that there is an occasion. Cubierto por nubes, covered by clouds in Spanish. Many of his works have been exhibited with translation. Lawrence Weiner believes that the material concerns of the sculptures transcend the particularities of any one language and can exist, and do exist, equally in any language. This is from the Art Gallery New South Wales website. This and that put here and there out of sight of Polaris. It was conceived specifically for the 8th Biennial of Sydney in 1990 and was installed under Lawrence Weiner's supervision. At the time he was planning this work, he was also working on a commission for an outdoor public sculpture in Denmark which read, "Some of this, some of that, gently placed under the light of Polaris." These 2 works are closely related in concept, one situated where the North Star Polaris is noticeably high in the sky, and the other situated at the other end of the world where the North Star is not visible at all. In an artist statement printed in the biennial's catalog, Weiner wrote, "Essentially, the question is whether or not a change in venue does in fact bring about a change in value. with the material moved here and there, does the displacement give not only the materials but as well the assemblage, another use for art within the society it finds itself functioning with? Is the placement of the object in relation to the human being the point? Or is the placement of the human being in relation to the object the fact? I'm up in the air. The wind is blowing inside. These are photographs of mine from a series I did on player piano rolls, and the lyrics are rubber stamped alongside the perforations. You're a million miles from nowhere. This is an image also from player piano rolls that I made for a piece titled The Melody Indicator, an online project I did with Triple Canopy in 2012. This piece, You're a Million Miles from Nowhere, is part of a series of sequences comprised of song titles from player piano roll boxes. I'm interested in the disembodied phrase, here suggesting both a place and no place. Language allows us to simultaneously traverse this contradictory terrain. Lawrence Weiner's work can take on unpredictable meanings in each instance of its realization. It's not that there isn't a consciousness to the possible readings in a given context, it's that there are infinite future contexts which would provide meanings that can't be anticipated. The structure of the work, by existing with the receiver, carries with it its potential to vary in meaning. Smashed to Pieces in the Still of the Night from 1991, written in large letters on the side of a Second World War anti-aircraft defense tower in Esterhazy Park, Vienna. Writing in the art newspaper in 2012, Louisa Buck says, despite the fact that in certain locations Weiner's text can seem to chime almost uncannily with their direct surroundings, he is equally insistent they are never tied to a specific location. Even though he concedes that Smashed to Pieces in the Still of the Night, which was installed on a Nazi-era flak-term tower, has an unfortunate reference to Kristallnacht, Weiner says this was unintentional and makes the point that installed in the South Pacific, the piece could just as easily refer to coconuts falling off trees. My work is never site-specific. And in this interview from the online magazine Another, Lawrence Weiner says, that piece had nothing to do with Kristallnacht. It was to do with the fact that listening to smashing bottles in a major city such as Vienna takes on a very different tone in the middle of the night. You make something because you like the green of a Jameson bottle of whiskey. You put it out there, and somebody responds because they have this desperate need to understand their relationship to green for whatever reason. Either they were brutalized in Ireland, or green was the color of the eyes of the only person they ever fell in love with. They can take what you've made and use it in their life to understand their place in the real world. All art should be this universal. Artists have a role in this society, and it's a real, honest-to-goodness role. And that's to take these universal things and place them out there, and be that as it may. And now I'm going to read a few excerpts from a 1994 article in Parquet called The Public Reacts, where people were interviewed in Vienna in their reaction to this piece. A man said, relatively contradictory words indicate strength, forceful language. Peace indicates stillness, rest, and harmony. I ask myself questions. Does the anti-aircraft tower do the smashing? At night, it radiates and shines. It looks phosphorescent. I like it a lot. More art on the tower. You shouldn't give up hope. It will certainly make a few people think. It can start something. And a woman says, actually, I don't understand the content. What do they mean by smashed? I don't know what the point is. I wish so much they would plant creepers. I see it all the time, every day. Maybe they could add some greenery. And a young woman says, who did that? Is the sentence by him? Only the sentence? I need to think about it. How long has that been up there, that sentence? Maybe they could make it more colorful, the sentence. That would be nice. And a young foreigner says, it must mean something, but who wrote it? Can you explain it to me? I'm going to remember that sentence. Maybe I can use it someday. You really can't control how a piece will be received. This is from a series I'm working on called Newspaper Clippings. And I keep finding instances now like this where I realize I have a piece that employs a similar word and can conjure up adjacent meanings. However, I have not employed this work in an outdoor public art setting. In Franz Kafka's unfinished novel, America, the main character is observing the street below his uncle's house shortly after his arrival in New York City. I think this captures what I was trying to say earlier about growing up in the city, but I'm reading it now because of the way that those experiences find particular applications in public settings. From morning to evening and far into the dreaming night, that street was the channel for a constant stream of traffic which, seen from above, looked like an inextricable confusion, forever newly improvised, of foreshortened human figures and the roofs of all kinds of vehicles, sending into the upper air another confusion, more riotous and complicated, of noises, dusts, and smells, all of it enveloped and penetrated by a flood of light which the multitudinous objects in the street scattered, carried off and again busily brought back, with an effect as palpable to the dazzled eye as if a glass roof stretched over the street were being violently smashed into fragments at every moment. In the mid-1980s in New York, I worked in public art, first as an administrator for City Arts Workshop, and then with the city's Parks and Recreation Department for a program called Murals in the Parks, where I participated in organizing and painting murals on parks property with communities of all ages throughout the city. City Arts was a small organization with a large reach. There were 3 people in the office, the executive director, the art director, and me. And for a period of about 6 months, I was the acting art director. The project mission was to invite artists to develop community-responsive public art projects by actively engaging community participation. While there were a number of successful projects, and I'm defining success within City Art's own terms of community engagement, what I remember most vividly at that time were the discussions around Richard Serra's Tilted Arc in Lower Manhattan, commissioned by the city's Art and Architecture program in 1981 and later removed in 1989, and how it came to exemplify what City Arts was trying to avoid. I came away with a feeling that sometimes challenging art and community responsiveness can be irreconcilable. And I have to add that that was how I felt in the 80s. I feel as though the whole things have really developed way past that, but that was the kind of tension at the time. And Lawrence Weiner's work doesn't impose on the viewer as public art. There are no restricting metaphors, and because it can open up possible meanings and the viewer can engage or not. In 2000, Lawrence Weiner created New York City manhole covers in cooperation with Con Edison and Roman Stone. Functional manhole covers that read, "in direct line with another and the next," in reference to the grid of New York City streets. They could be found in 19 locations below Union Square. What I love about this work is the combination of abstraction and specificity, and that it inserts itself into the city's infrastructure. You walk past it, look, and then look again, or not. I took some photographs of manhole covers as an homage. Rachel Whiteread's Water Tower was another wonderful example of a public artwork engaging with the vernacular visual landscape. In both these works, the existing structures are celebrated while at the same time something else is introduced. The vernacular landscape is the source material for my work, looking at the incidental language generated by various institutional systems like the Dewey Decimal Card Catalogue, or finding language and imagery within the constraints of the page sequence of a book. This is from my project Dog Year. Moves a pile, examined the material, jammed, nothing was more. And this is a piece from my Naked Eye series. Both operate where the sequence of the organization of the image is determined by the way the book is constructed. While I don't make public art, my work pulls towards and away from the situations that generate it. Moving in and out, the vernacular landscape is both a source material and a destination. Here's another public artwork by Lawrence Weiner. Placed above the horizon, casting shadows. The piece is on the exterior of the Vancouver Art Gallery, and the Canadian Public Art website has the following information about the work. Remarks on location. On the portico of the gallery facing Robeson Street. Description. A text written in yellow cedar is embedded on the southern facade of the Vancouver Art Gallery above the columns. Text of the artwork. Placed upon the horizon, casting shadows. Text theme. Statement could refer to the non-existing sightline. I love that. Could refer to the non-existing sightline that is obscured by the city, while casting shadows describe one of the work's physical properties. Like the manhole covers or Rachel Whiteread's water tower, we see something else within a pre-existing structure. I was surprised when I started paying attention to the number of times my work has crossed paths with Lawrence Weiner. And so here's just a couple of examples. Matthew Copeland did a project called Exhibition of a Film, and I contributed work to it, and so did Lawrence Weiner. His piece, his contribution, all that we see in cinema is false, and yet it is the only reality we know. And my contribution to the film was a selection from my series Viewmasters, and look, see number 1? Polaris, although here it's a spaceship. Blasting away from the sun, the Polaris nears Mars. The Viewmasters, along with another series, Blanks, were part of a 2-person book I did with Francis Baudevin. Francis contributed images from his collection of yellow record covers, which includes this one by Lawrence Weiner, having been built on sand with another basis in fact, and the German translation below. So in conclusion, Lawrence Weiner's statements are always presented in very precise language. This precision, this simplicity, paradoxically lends itself to layers of complexity and carries with it future endless possibilities. It is this very open-endedness that provides us with a constantly contemporary experience. And I began with 2 titles, and I'm ending here with 2 more, and all of them serve to describe this talk. Thank you.
So I wanted to open up to questions. I know it usually takes a minute, but if you have one, feel free to raise your hand. And thank you, Erica. It's fantastic. Say it louder. He'd like an E. He is little wheel, a Jeopardy? No, sorry, Wheel of Fortune? Sorry. Like an E. Comments are welcome too. Anybody? It can be questions for Erica about her practice or the talk. Or none at all. It's fine too. It's best sometimes just let it resonate. Okay. Thank you so much. Oh, sorry. We have one? I'll take this one question. Do you mind if I just get it done? Sure.
Towards the end of your talk, I realized that you were talking in a sort of informational mode or declarative mode, or the syntax was really different from the language in the artworks that we were looking at. And so I wanted to ask you about what you think about how, or maybe the difference, or how you arrived at your decision of how to use language tonight, or how you think about your language in your work or in his work.
Well, I think there was a lot of different kinds of language employed. So in some cases, like the last part with the casting shadows upon the horizon, I was quoting from the very functional website, and I kind of like that very informational tone. That to me, that part describes that the most. But I kind of, in a way, I think I wanted to give a range of different kinds of language to sort of juxtapose, because I'm explaining so much, and then it helps to kind of break it up with different styles. So, I mean, I think in my own use of language, I don't think as precisely as Lawrence Weiner. He's so precise. And I'm a lot looser, and a lot of definitions, things will, I mean, the word metaphor, for a long time when I was reading that, I would think, what is a metaphor? It took me a long time, so, yeah.
Hi. I was really interested when you designated your practice and you said that you didn't make public art and that you used to make public art. Because I know Lawrence Weiner, for instance, he'll consider all of the work public because it's text and because it's published. And you work with so much public material that's published. So I just was wondering if you could talk about why you feel that it's no longer public art.
Well, I mean, when I was working in public art in the 80s, it wasn't really my own work. I was working as an administrator, facilitating other people's work. And when I worked for the Parks Department, I was out there with a paintbrush, but it wasn't really my work. It was more about community engagement. It was a different thing. But I accept that argument that any work could be considered public. I mean, I have a lot of stuff that's just online, and anybody can look at it. And any art is free to come and see. I mean, galleries don't, ask admission. So the definition of public art, I really just meant that I haven't done anything that would allow the public to react in a physical way, the way that they did with that example with Smashed to Pieces. That's really what I meant.
Thanks.
Yeah, nice talk, Erica. Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about is sort of the difference, or, a difference, is it not? You use so much found language in your work, and Weiner's language sometimes, more maybe frequently, seems to kind of borrow on familiar language, but it often feels to me more constructed or sort of thought out. I mean, you were talking about how precise he is. And I wonder if you kind of thought much about that sort of difference between the sort of the use of found and the possibly sort of constructed, or it's a different, maybe a different way of constructing a kind of poetry.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I did. I mean, I was trying to think of ways in which his work was something that my practice was similar to, so I was trying to find a way in, because actually, if I think about how I begin, it's from a very different place. And I begin by finding things rather than begin by constructing them. So, yeah, I did think about that. I wasn't entirely sure how to talk about that.
Hi, thanks for all of your thoughts and presentation. I'm kind of thinking through this a little bit, so forgive me. I mean, whenever I've come across Lawrence's work, I think the openness is something that people really talk about a lot. But even in kind of listening through all of this, I think there's this weird counterpoint of like the kind of determinism or like power that's needed to kind of redefine what painting and sculpture and like all these things are, and have people believe you. And I don't really ever hear about like those kind of very closed, specific, controlled viewpoints. You mean like a reaction to that? Well, that's really not, like that's not really talked about in comparison with this kind of very open generousness almost of his work. So anyway, I was just wondering if in your thoughts on his work you find that as a contradiction or perhaps like just a necessary condition.
Well, I think in a way that's what's so interesting, because it's so, he makes these definitions that on the one hand could seem rigid, and yet that rigidity opens up. And so when I was talking about complex simplicity, it's that same kind of thing, like taking something that ends up arriving almost at its opposite. So I kind of appreciate it. I mean, it's very different from my sensibility, but it arrives at something that I can really appreciate. Sorry.
That was an awesome topic. So I had questions totally out of the scope of the talk, but that always kind of bugged me about Weiner that I thought maybe you could address a little bit, which is how the statements aren't poetry, but they're clearly statements aren't poetry, right? But they're clearly worked, right? They're scrubbed with certain kinds of references, and I was just wondering if you just knew anything about how he decides a statement is ready to go, or how these statements evolve, or if you came across anything like that in your research?
I mean, I think it's really very literal. Like that description of the piece he made in Vermont that was destroyed by the students, it reads like a Lawrence Weiner piece right there, like that very specific, this is, and I really think his sense of making the piece comes out of looking at these objects and working, but I don't have any kind of insight into the very specific moments of those things. I didn't.
Some could describe works, and those are sort of easier to process, but something that sort of takes a common phrase, which phrases does he like, or would you have the weird similes like KS pie?
Yeah, I mean, actually, you probably can see in my talk, I didn't work with a lot of those. I really worked with the ones that were more concrete. Even this shirt is a little bit out there for me. but yeah, I mean, I think it's intriguing, and how did he get to those more, but I didn't address them, so.
Okay, thank you again, Erica. Thank you all for coming.